Building your model around limiting artificially access to things. Sure, it's a way to make money, but is it the best way when, in theory, like the more people who have access to knowledge, kind of the better society is? Welcome to the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast. I'm your regular host, Nate Cooper, and with me this season, I have Eve McKnight as my co-host. In this season of Cut Your Learning Curve, we're sponsored by Swarm, a digital product design agency and management consultancy. Swarm helps you connect the dots and mitigate the risks associated with launching a digital product, website, or idea. Thanks for joining me, Eve. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Eve McKnight. I teach about project management all over the United States with my company, Little Owl, and I'm also the Director of Learning here at Swarm.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me, Eve. If you're new to the podcast, Cut Your Learning Curve is where we help you rethink how you can learn new skills that benefit your professional career and the projects that you want to develop. So let's jump into the episode. So Eve and I are talking about a lot of topics related to hiring, jobs, the future of work, education being a big component of that. And we were really interested, I think Eve and I met because we're educators. And with all of the changes that have been happening this year with the quarantine, universities going online, schools teaching remotely, and kind of the question about returning and not returning, there's all kinds of things going on right now. We're now just about in back to school season at the end of August as we're recording this. And so we wanted to devote some time to talk about what, as people are kind of going through this sort of new university experience, what are the important things in regards to getting hired? So the framing question for this episode is, when we hire, what's most important to us as employers and what are we looking for? So Eve, this was your topic. I'd love to hear your thoughts just on where things are at. And I know you have some pending things at the moment just in terms of your own teaching.
Yes. Well, so the pending I think that Nate was referring to is I actually teach at New York University myself. New York NYU is one of the schools that is, as of today, August 21st, 2020. That's the day we're recording this, if you're listening to it and there's snow outside. And they're still committed to in-person teaching. Obviously, a lot of schools, as somebody who follows these issues, there's schools just shutting down by the day. This week, it was University of North Carolina and Notre Dame were in the news. And basically, certainly my own class that I teach was originally going to be in person. For our particular subset of the student body, it turned out that online is better because, frankly, we have so many foreign students, and I think a lot of them just aren't coming back to the States at this time. I don't know. And I don't think that's a secret. And so we've transformed it into an online course very quickly. But the bigger question to me, and there's just so much news about it, about frat parties and socially distancing, and every university is trying to figure it out in a different way, and there's really no playbook that these guys are working off of or sharing. It seems like UPenn, I think, isn't teaching. I just feel like every day I'm reading about a new university planning to be online only for some version of some period of time. And what really struck me with all of this, as I've read article after article, there's a lot about it in the news, is literally no one is asking, well, what is the impact on this for job opportunities? And, in the first, there's a couple different layers to that. So I guess I'll just jump ahead. One, the layer of, hey, I'm looking at somebody who just graduated from Yale. This person happened to spend one or two semesters online and the rest in person. As an employer, do I care? Absolutely not, is the short answer there. But then the larger question is, if it really doesn't matter to us, and I think we'll get there, so this is sort of something we'll probably talk about more midway. If we really don't care even a little bit, if these people learn in person or online, why is it such a big deal? And Harvard accepts 5% for in-person, but some of their open online education classes have tens of thousands of people attending them. So the question here is, I think there is a seismic change happening in the field of education. So Nate runs Swarm. He is CEO of Swarm. Swarm is a digital web agency based in New York City. When you hire, starting there, what do you look for?
In regards to their education specifically, or just in general?
I think both, but let's say, you run through a resume. I think first in terms of education, and then are there bigger things than education that you keep an eye out for? So I think it would be good to address both.
Well, I think we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the developer mindset and some issues around that is that, like, I mean, technology is changing so much that oftentimes I think a traditional education may not be as beneficial as sort of depth of knowledge in a particular area, especially when you talk about engineering hires, things like that. I mean, I think it does depend. Obviously, like somebody with a CS degree has a depth of knowledge that's different than somebody who sort of went through a coding boot camp or taught themselves. But whether that depth of knowledge is necessary for a given project varies quite a bit, so it would really sort of depend on, I think, factors related to the work. And certainly when it comes to things like design, I mean, I'm often not really looking so much about the resume. I'm looking at a portfolio, so I think in a lot of cases when it comes to agency work, you want to see the breadth of their work, the variety, their client list, their case studies, their familiarity with particular sort of depths of particular knowledge. Are they sort of a front-end developer? Are they a mobile developer? Things like that are going to be more important depending on what you're looking for. That, in a university education may or may not have a factor in. A mobile developer with a CS degree is going to operate differently than someone who doesn't, and it's gonna take more years in the marketplace to make up for that difference. But a designer, I don't know. I've taught at design schools, and I think there's a lot of value in a design education, but I also think there's a lot of talented people out there who are very creative and just put in a lot of effort and build up a portfolio that I think is very marketable, even without that formal education.
Yeah, so I think there's also a distinction. So thanks, Nate, for that starting point. I do think there's a distinction between us as people who essentially run teams, manage teams. Both between us, Nate and I have delivered a lot of product. Nate more on the website. I headed up project management at a tech startup in Manhattan called Scroll Motion with a fairly sizable team of 18 project managers, and we just delivered thousands and thousands of mobile apps to iTunes, Android, etc. And so, we spend a lot of our time really looking for, well, who do we need to deliver whatever we need to get done? I do think our perspective on it is different, and I actually work quite a lot on this issue now because I work so much with people looking to get hired in this space. Certainly the thing that I see again and again is, so let's say from project management standpoint, the distinction I think is between us and say a head of HR somewhere or a recruiter, someone in the HR field or a recruiter. I feel like they look to tick off boxes a lot more than probably Nate or I. I think they're given a set of criteria. They haven't really lived these roles, so I wouldn't say it means the same thing to them. And actually, I teach a course on job skills right now. And, one of the biggest challenges actually, I think in the next several years, and something I see again and again and again, is you have X skill set. It's actually fairly translatable to a different career. How do you get past the gatekeepers to convince them of this? So it's a little different take than what Nate was talking about. But for example, in the space of project management, the sweet spot in my world is 2 to 5 years experience. It means, you've really been in the trenches for a while. And then it's strongly preferred that, you've done 2 to 5 years at an agency. We have a lot of agency work here in New York City, where we're both based. Or 2 to 5 years doing large-scale software implementations in X industry. Or, whatever that specialty is. And it's always fascinating to me that when people try to move into that different role, there's just such a stress, at least again in my space of work, around, well, do you have precisely that area of experience? And again, 2 to 5 years being the sweet spot for these sort of mid-level positions, we could call it. And it's really interesting to me how many people I meet who are actually fairly new graduates or have been doing something else and want to jump into the field of project management specifically, and getting that first gig, getting that in the door is really quite challenging for them. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned recruiting, and that was it's interesting thinking about that because I know several recruiters, and at least in the field of engineering, they won't try to place anybody without a CS degree. And there is that gatekeeper there. And I just gave an example where I said it can be obviously very beneficial to have, but it's not always a requirement depending on what you're trying to do. But recruiters don't feel that way. And if they're trying to do job placement, I mean, it's like it's an absolute checkbox. But I'm curious to know, when you're talking about the gatekeepers, like, talk a little bit more about that. Do you think that that's changing in the market, and how are things different because kind of the situation we have now with universities going online and changing? And
Right. That's interesting. I think it goes a couple directions. So when wasn't even aware I used the term gatekeeper, so that's funny. And mostly I was just pulling it from my own experience and experiences I've seen elsewhere. So new job comes available, 100 people send in their resumes. Someone is going to do a first pass. Someone. Maybe a recruiter, or maybe a recruiter is just looking at LinkedIn profiles. Maybe it's, again, someone in HR on the ground. And then someone like us, typically, would be handed a short stack of finalists, right, that hit whatever criteria there were. And I couldn't agree more with what Nate was talking about checking boxes. Again, just from the project management standpoint, like PMP is a big certification for us. However, there's really only certain industries where absolutely you need it. In other industries, it's actually regarded, I would say, with a little bit of even disdain or just apathy. So I do feel like whoever that first person is, that first person funneling from a big crowd to a small crowd, and I think it even happens in things like film, like talent agents, they do that first pass. I think what they look for and what we look for actually are somewhat different. And I think overcoming that is something that some organizations really spend a lot of time and energy on, and you can actually see in the job descriptions without getting into too much detail about that. At the same time, not to be too critical of education, sorry about this, but basically, and I feel like what's happening in the last couple of weeks has really brought it to light again, is the model that is post-secondary, so advanced education in the United States, that whole model has just been moving towards not being sustainable for quite some time. Let's say 20 years at this point, right? A semester, a year at a place like NYU costs more than an average American's median salary. I mean, it's just crazy. So it's just completely unaffordable. At the same time, you see a lot of these elite universities accepting a smaller and smaller percentage. You also have something like adjuncting, which presents just a glut of academics. So there's all these different forces at work at the same time. At the same time, which is so interesting to me, is all of these things happening in education have this weird relationship with the actual job market, where I actually do think simple, straightforward, entry-level jobs are disappearing. That are stable and consistent and predictable and actually lead you on a pathway to something else. Like, I think that's just going away. I also think, from our standpoint, I guess, and I'm trying to get at this in a couple different ways, but if I see Harvard on a diploma, like if somebody writes Harvard grad 2005, like I just know immediately they're really smart. I mean, that's just my assumption. Now, some others might posit, well, they had some privilege to get there in the first place. That's a fair argument. But it does have a certain amount of credence.
Yeah.
And I do certainly think it'll always check a box with recruiters. I've never met a recruiter that isn't biased towards elite colleges, ever. I've never even heard of them. So, because it's this very recognizable standard, a little bit like the SATs, in the sense that everyone takes it and it's measurable above all else. So what has not happened yet is true parity with something more online, also leading to similar success in the job world. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
You mean something online, meaning like online education?
Yeah, that it has maybe the same track record. I think there's some exceptions. I've heard Georgia Tech has a bunch of stuff online that leads to certificates. We were looking at some stuff this week too. We were talking about the difference between sort of a MOOC, like a more online open course, versus something where you're actually getting some kind of certificate and presumably some kind of accountability.
I feel like there's a lot of parity with the things that are happening in journalism, where you have, like, what is the difference between the New York Times and my personal blog? You know what I mean? Is there a difference? And what is the value of publishing an article in the New York Times instead of doing a guest post on my personal blog? Is that, I think that education is kind of having a similar reckoning in that way, because it's sort of like, is there value in that brand? Like there's brand recognition. And what does that brand recognition sort of stand in for? To your point, it stands for kind of quality. It stands for kind of an elite set of skills, that sort of thing. It's a shorthand. And I think much like journalism going online, there's a lot of challenges to how do you sort of preserve the things that got that brand to where it is. Because I don't think it's just that that's a popular brand and that's why it is that people grab onto it. I think it's what that brand sort of represents. For the New York Times, it's kind of like it's a very sort of trusted source where you assume that the people who stand behind it have kind of gone through some sort of process, and that there's some sort of vetting. And I feel like that's very similar to Harvard, right? And what is happening with things like the New York Times, and I don't know 100% for sure if New York Times is a good example of this, but some of these sort of institutions of journalism are experimenting with things like native content as a business model, where they basically sell space that looks like a news story to an advertiser. And so instead of going through the same vetting process, some publications are putting articles up that sort of appear as if they were written by that publication. And I think, the reason I'm trying to draw a parallel here is that, if you want to learn how to code online, you don't necessarily have to go through MIT CS, program. You could go learn it for free on Code Academy, depending on what your sort of end goals are. And maybe that's a better route than going to MIT, depending on what you want your end goal to be. In the short term or in the long term, maybe that's actually a better place to start. But what is the difference between what Code Academy is doing and if MIT puts a program online? I think you start to get into this same sort of questionable dynamic as native content, where you have maybe there is like some question about how well it stacks up. Like, is it as valuable? Is it the same thing? Is it just that the brand equity is strong and therefore it's going to sell better in the marketplace? I mean, I think arguably there's probably, from my own perspective, having taught in academia, there's probably a lot more rigor with hopefully, even with the online programs. But to the consumer, there isn't always like a clear difference. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, I think once you go into this online world, you really play with this space of like uncertainty from the level of an end user, let's say, who's trying to figure out, what do I do next? I want to learn this skill. Is it better to go here or is it better to go there? And is the only difference just the stamp I get on my diploma, or is there like a difference in quality as well?
Well, I actually think there's two issues there, right? So the quality you're actually getting and the brand itself, right? Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that I think COVID has been very effective at, and I think I mentioned this in another podcast, is just shining light on all kinds of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's really shined a lot of light on is, does Harvard really need to be 4% where everybody's on campus? Like, yes, it's not as fun. Tell me it's really you're learning less. Tell me you're actually learning less about biochemistry. Like, mm-hmm. None of this is shaking out to be about coursework. None of it. Mm-hmm. That said, like what I said before, it is and what you just said too, like we just both talked about. I think, and certainly there are many people who would not consider the New York Times a trusted brand. I think we can agree on that one.
Sure, yeah.
But, for us both, it is a shorthand. Like, they have that lovely font. I have the New York Times app. Full disclosure, I'm a subscriber. And I scroll through these articles and I count on that they've been fact-checked, right? And I count on, yes, the rigor of journalism. And frankly, there's a lot less journalism jobs left these days, paid journalism jobs. So the writing is really, really good. I taught English many moons ago. So I just really enjoy it from that perspective. And honestly, a lot of the articles tend to fit very well together. It is really a narrative if you read a lot of it, I feel like. So for better and for worse. So I definitely think both points are true. But also, I do think education, and we had a podcast a week or two ago where we talked about, the distributed nature of the internet. Mm-hmm. And I still think that's such a reflection on the attitude of the people who created the internet in the first place, that there doesn't need to be. Gatekeeper is my favorite term for people who hold power and information in a way that distributes to others. I think of the New York Times as a gatekeeper because they determine what is news and they share this to a large audience, right? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people who founded the internet and who founded the space of computers that we live in today just didn't see a lot of value in having these key decision makers above them. An ideal version of that is a more equitable world where there was less people above making decisions. That's a very optimistic look at it. And, in a way, I think it's why Facebook is really paralyzed about being a curator of content, because it's not really where they ever planned on ending up. Now, there's other things they could have done about it, but they suddenly are also responsible for quality, which really wasn't their original vision of any of this. And so just to get back to education, I think for the moment, and I really don't know why there's such a small number of elite universities, and then there's sort of a next tier after that. I'm not really sure why such a small handful of universities kind of shot the moon in terms of acceptance rates, right? Like there's maybe 24 universities in the United States that are 10% or under. Mm-hmm. And then everybody else, and then there's actually a 60% of universities, some huge percentage, these are estimates, that accept over half. So of applicants. So there is a pretty big jump there. I think that there is something very real in the brand of being accepted into one of these places. But I also think in terms of quality, what you're really getting, and has been well written about before, is a network of very successful individuals and access to opportunity. And it's interesting that us as employers, one, I think it does help you get through somebody looking to check a box if you go to an elite school, but you also do tend to know people in other fields, and that can help you get in. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, totally. I think from the consumer perspective, it's very different. One thing I wanted to mention too is just a lot of times and increasingly, while you're talking about checking the boxes, it's not even a person, it's an algorithm. So, I think for now, these shorthands, kind of gatekeepers are still very relevant, So, I think it's but from the standpoint of is there a difference between, I guess the way you just framed it is kind of my sort of problem, if you will, with education in general in terms of its metric, which is that they're measured based on their acceptance rate, which is a form of artificial scarcity, which is something that essentially most online sort of entrepreneurs, let's say, often both really indulge in, and also I think the more egalitarian ones think about why that's problematic, because why limit, building sort of your model around limiting artificially access to things. Sure, it's a way to make money, but is it the best way when, in theory, the more people who have access to knowledge, kind of the better society is, the more opportunities there are, the more, there's this whole idea around blue ocean. Is that what it is? Where it's there aren't any competitors because, and we were talking about this in our marketing conversation, because we talked about the idea that there isn't, some people don't like the word competitor because there's kind of this blue ocean theory that there's so many fish in the sea, there's so many opportunities that why are you limiting things? So, it's from that perspective, I think something that's always kind of bothered me a little bit is that, it's literally the business model or maybe not business model, since whether they're businesses or not is kind of irrelevant, but the sort of the model around success is often about limiting access and how that's a successful thing. But in terms of what the sort of consumer gets out of it, if we're thinking sort of students, I had the opportunity, this thing has been popping up in my YouTube for the last week or so, and I finally got enticed to go back and watch it, which is this graduation speech from David Foster Wallace. Have you ever heard that one from
No.
Kenyon School? And It's really great. It's really worth checking out. But it's a commencement speech, and he talks the talk is basically about, it's called like This Is Water. So it's all about this idea that basically like two fish are swimming along and they're young and they pass by an older fish, and they ask the older fish like, "How's it going today?" And the older fish goes like, "Fine. How do you find the water?" And they go, "Oh, it's fine," and they swim past. And then they go, after the old fish passes by, the younger fish go, one of them turns to the other and says like, "What is water?" And so the whole talk is about how in college, you don't really get to experience the things that we all know as kind of like the water, kind of the minutia of life, which he describes. And David Foster Wallace is a novelist, so he describes in kind of excruciating detail what it's like to be like stuck at a supermarket line and just the reality of commuting and traffic and stuff. But so he's sort of examining what is the point of school, and I thought this was really interesting to kind of listen to before coming back to this today. And he said that it's often said kind of in a platitude of like, you're learning how to think. And he originally sort of thought of that as like, he was really rebellious against that idea when he was a student, because it sort of implies like, you don't know what you're doing. And of course you're smart enough to get into college. So why do you have to learn how to think? And his sort of take on this is like, it's actually more about what do you think about? And so he sort of says that, this minutia that we live in the day-to-day, kind of when we're living our lives and working in our careers, is kind of this default setting that we have as humans where we are the center of the universe and everything that we do is the most important thing. And that the value of a liberal arts education, at least in this case, is that teaching you how to think or learning how to think is about stepping out of that default mode and examining what it could be like to consider alternatives or kind of like empathy. He didn't really say that word, but I kept thinking of empathy in terms of like, that's a way to kind of step out of your sort of selfhood, and that this is really the value of like sort of traditional education, is that sort of learning how to think. Because
to get to where we started today, does that demand being in person in a beautiful campus with like maple trees and stuff, engaging with professors, sitting around in a circle? Is that necessitated to have that experience? Is that required? Sorry.
Is it required to get the job, or is it required?
No, you're arguing that there's some real intrinsic benefit in going through liberal arts college, typically 4 years here in America. And sure. I was asking, well, to get back to where we started today, like, is it different if you're not on campus? Is it different if it's all people over Zoom? And I would imagine he doesn't really address that, but I was trying to like bring it back to where we started.
No, totally. I mean, I think that, I think you nailed it when you said earlier that a lot of the value of that isn't, because I think, obviously like this learning how to think and step out of your sort of default setting is important, but I think bigger than that, typically, and the way I would sort of frame it as sort of a market value, or like, what do you get out of it in terms of marketability as a future employee, is the connections you make. And I would say probably a lot of this stuff in terms of being able to think outside of your default. Yes, a lot of it probably does come from examining texts or hearing lectures or whatever, but I think arguably it's also the connections you make.
So if that's the case, right, then wouldn't we as employers really, because I would argue that leads to we had a whole podcast on this. My argument about resilience, there's different ways people think about it, but how I see it is you're presented a challenge or a setback, and you come up with another way to overcome, go around it. You figure out ways to keep moving. And what I see in the world, and people tell me, is they work with recent college graduates who are 23, 24, and it's almost been like excavated out of them, like teeth. Like they're, sorry for all these likes on a podcast. They have no self capacity for problem solving, none. Now, that's not to say they weren't exposed to it at wherever, Yale, and that it will mature at some point in time. But if the whole argument is this will make you an intellectually richer person because you went to this nice school for 4 years and you come out and you really so many more senior managers, really not that much further along, maybe 10 or 15 years, they'll say to me, I have this staff member and I just have to tell them every single thing. They just stop. They don't think, how can I solve this problem?
Mm.
So if that was really true, what you were saying, if we're really saying it's conditional on being there in person, talking to other people, wouldn't we notice the difference ourselves as people who hire, I think, from both worlds? That's
yeah,
what
I mean,
would
I guess,
argue. And that might show up more in the future, by the way.
Yeah, no, totally.
So-
But I was also kind of leaving open the whether it's necessary to be in person, because I think I think it's really interesting, even just on a personal level, like the differences in how people react to socializing virtually. I've worked remotely for years now, and for me, this is an ongoing conversation because my fiance teaches young children. And so she's used to being in the classroom, and it was a very tough adjustment for her to have to teach online. Me moving from our office, although it's a nice office and I miss being in it on occasion, to working from home, I feel like I socialize all day. And I've been talking about this a lot recently. It's just like I'm constantly on Slack, emailing and calls, all this stuff. And so to me, there isn't really, there's definitely a difference. Absolutely, in terms of how communication manifests, but whether you get sort of the same value out of that communication, I think is probably going to vary quite a bit, because I think some people really do. There's the introvert, extrovert, people who are going to do better when they are forced to be, in a place with people.
And there's already been some writing about it too, that some people prefer sort of being at home. But just because I know we're on time, I wanted to just bring it back to kind of where we started. You mentioned a few minutes ago, you said whether it was not, I do think of it as the business model for sure. And I think this idea of scarcity is 100% true. Harvard could accept 30% and they would still have just astonishing, talented students. I think we all know this. Honestly, even somebody who said I was waitlisted at Harvard, that would just hit a bell for me. They might as well just leave it on their resume. Nobody does that, but why not, man? And it is such a perception of scarcity. And, is it the best way is the next thing you said. And I wholeheartedly do not think it is. And what's interesting to me in the two areas we've been discussing, quality and brand, is how incredibly little the administrators of major universities, really worldwide, but certainly we're talking about America today, have not responded to the challenge. Now, you could argue someplace like University of Phoenix, that's enormous, has, but I've never worked with anyone who went there and was sort of bowled over by their competence. And I do think something Nate mentioned earlier is, how do we ensure quality in all these different, whether it's a coding academy, whether it's 6 weeks at General Assembly where we work, talking about product, another area that isn't that covered by academia. Mm-hmm. But I do feel very strongly that these guys have had 20 years to see that this is a business model that relies on scarcity, that relies on dorms and frats and climbing walls and, Saturday afternoon tailgating. And now that it's all being pulled away in real time under the spotlight of national media, and no one is actually talking about what are the chances of these students having real jobs when they graduate. No one at all. Politicians, journalists, no one. It really does show the hollowness of it all, I think. And there was a piece this week, I'd rather not mention which university, but the medical professionals basically said, we're in a state where we're just completely unprepared to open. The staff was saying, here's all this stuff you can do to open. And the students had no interest in following the rules. And it was all three all at once. And just the fact that these universities are clinging so much to models that I feel like very fundamentally don't serve the business needs of today.
Yeah.
Really watching them stuck in these spotlights, saying these crazy things is really was the impetus for today, that there will need to be a better model. And it's also true for work. So I think they go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Well, wow. There's a lot to talk about here. I feel like we've probably identified at least one additional podcast just from the depth of knowledge here, and just the amount of stuff we could talk about. But I appreciate the conversation today. Eve, do you want to tell people how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, great. So I have a training company. I'm at littleowl.us. I teach a lot of classes here in the New York City area. They're on my Facebook page, facebook.com/littleowl with a 1 at the end.
And I'm at Nate Cooper on Twitter. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to learn with us today. This has been the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast sponsored by Swarm. Don't forget to go to swarmnyc.com/learn. There you can sign up for our email newsletter and connect with us on social media.
Thanks, Eve. And again, my name is Nate Cooper. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day and happy learning.